Welcome to Digital Transformers, the show that connects you with what you need to build, manage, and operate your digital supply chain. Join your host in a timely discussion on new and future business models with industry-leading executives. The show will reveal global customer expectations, real-world deployment challenges, and the value of advanced business technologies like artificial intelligence, blockchain, and robotic process engineering. And now, we bring you Digital Transformers.
Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Emerging Gov Tech Live. I'm happy to be here with Gerard. Hey, Gerard, what's up?
Great to be here with you, Kevin.
Okay, we got a great show today, and it's very timely. I tell you this, there is so much going on when it comes to blockchain and government budgets. Who would thunk it, right? And today we have a couple of great experts to tell us exactly how this is kind of revolutionizing government if we hadn't had enough changes. So we're going to be covering a lot in today's show. And also, after this show, don't forget to join us in the round table. As we go into it, Gerard, why don't you sort of give us an idea or introduce our guests for today's show?
Kevin, thank you so much for putting this together and your leadership in this whole series. We are doing this on a monthly basis on Emerging Gov Tech. This month is really tracking budgets on a blockchain. So this idea started back in 2018. Nobody really wanted to talk to us about then. Nobody was really interested. But there was something that happened at the beginning of 2020 that kind of shook government and blockchain. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I do want to let you know that the GBA is primarily focusing on web type events. We do have an annual achievement awards coming up at the end of the year. If you go to the gbaglobal.org website, at the very top, you'll see the annual achievement awards. So nominate people that you think deserve to be recognized. All right, let me go ahead and introduce our two panelists. And Kevin's going to actually take a little bit of time and give us some background in terms of why right now is such an important time for this industry. In fact, Kevin, why don't you do that first? And then I'll go ahead and introduce our two panelists for today.
That'd be fine. So if you've been tracking the news lately, you know that last week, the president held his first White House Crypto Summit. And this is really important because the legislation is really focusing on making the United States a global power when it comes to crypto. So the summit, and also the president signed an executive order creating a strategic Bitcoin reserve and a digital asset stockpile. And in fact, just this morning, the state of Texas authorized $250 million to buy Bitcoin. And there are like 21 other states in the queue that are talking about passing similar bills. Also, the Senate moved to overturn two Biden-era regulations that the crypto industry opposed. And there's really a drive to simplify compliance and auditability of digital assets. There was also, I guess, news made when Elon Musk appeared on a podcast with his vision for blockchain for the United States. And in fact, he specifically talked about putting the U.S. Treasury spending on a blockchain. The proposal is meant to increase transparency and eradicating the alleged fraud that has sparked discussions about its feasibility, benefits, and risk. By using blockchain, all transactions within the U.S. Treasury would be tracked in real time on a public ledger. It's kind of scary, ensuring full visibility and possibly reducing the potential for fraud, shifting from a reactive posture for compliance to a proactive risk management. And the government, and one of the biggest questions in this is, will the government use existing blockchains, public blockchains, like Ethereum or Cardano, or will it create a brand new proprietary permissioned ledger for this activity? And we have two outstanding experts to tell us more about what's going on in the government. Gerard?
Yeah, and I'd like to just mention there's a couple other things that's happening really in the digital asset space. In fact, just recently out of Argentina, there was a big issue with a token that came out called the Libra, and the president of that country endorsed it, then found out that there was nothing behind it. They'd done a big rug pull, and now that president is up for impeachment because of what was happening with the digital assets in that country. And so as we look as what's happening here in the United States and this effort at both local levels and national levels to start using digital assets for budget tracking and a lot of other things, it really bears out one of the things that we'll talk about later, which is why standards are important, right? Why people need to know and understand what digital assets are, how they can be used, how government can use them. And that's just part of an exciting conversation. So we'll be talking about this during this hour, but there's really so much more to cover in terms of the vast numbers of ways that governments can use digital assets for budget tracking and so many other ways. But Kevin, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speakers.
Yes.
And Kevin's right. I mean, we couldn't bring two better powerhouses in this area. So let me tell you about Amelia Gardner first. So Amelia is a trailblazer in government innovation and emerging gov tech. As the former Utah County Clerk Auditor, she led a groundbreaking initiative, including the first fully online marriage license portal and one of the very first blockchain-based voting systems in the U.S. So her system actually was used in a U.S. national election, right? One of the only places in the world where that happened. She now is serving as the Utah County Commissioner, where she continues to champion transparency, efficiency, and accountability in government. Amelia is not just a leader at the county level. She has strong relationships with members of the U.S. Congress and is a member of the United Nations Internet Governance Forum, Dynamic Coalition on Blockchain Assurance and Standardization. Her visionary leadership has earned her the 2020 GBA, Government Blockchain Association Annual Achievement Award. She's married to Tobin Gardner, who is a co-founder of the Utah Blockchain Coalition, and the two of them have been championing the use of blockchain and emerging technologies to make the world a better place for their kids and generations to come. So she'll be talking about this topic from a government perspective and somebody in government who not only has been using blockchain, but is looking forward on all the other ways that it can be used. Let me tell you about Paul. Paul is a good friend. I would say both Amelia and Paul have been good friends for many years. Both of them, their accolades are so impressive. Paul has over 30 years of banking and financial services experience. He's worked across operations, process design, process development, and IT service management. He's played key roles at some of the world's top financial institutions, including Bank of America, Chase Manhattan Bank, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, BNY Mellon, and he's consulted at DTCC, OCC, RBC, Citi, JP Morgan, Bridgewater, and Graham Capital. He currently serves as the GBA head of the Banking and Financial Services Working Group. He's the co-founder and head of design of L4S Corp, which is a company behind Tapestry X. It's a layer one blockchain protocol that is specifically designed for banking financial services. It has accounting built in at the layer one level, and is just absolutely tailor-made for this kind of conversation. He recently has been appointed as a member of the Government Blockchain Association Board of Directors. So Amelia is going to come to this conversation from the perspective of somebody in government who has and is going to use blockchain. And Paul is coming from the internal operations perspective and technology perspective with a vast understanding of how do you use this technology for very, very large financial systems. So again, couldn't be more proud and happier to have these two people with us today talking about this really important subject.
Well, welcome, Amelia and Paul.
Thank you for having us.
Who do you think? Amelia, let's start with you. You've had to solve a lot of tough problems. In fact, if you wouldn't mind, can you share with us a little bit about how you got into this space, right? Because the story that you have with both the voting and the marriage license, you've got a personal story about why that's important to you and how you essentially took that very personal thing that impacts you and your family and have widened it now to be able to have an impact on many more people. So tell us a little bit about your story and then a little bit about going forward, how you see this whole initiative.
Yeah, I think it's important to back up even one step further and say, why did I leave the private sector and get into government? I have an engineering background as a field service engineer and a continuous product improvement engineer at Caterpillar prior to joining up at public office. And one of the biggest things that I noticed is that my local government, while well-meaning, did not have defined processes. So in 2018, before anyone had ever heard of Doge, I was running for office on making government processes more efficient. Six Sigma and Kaizen were the language that I spoke in the corporate world and the manufacturing world, and I wanted to bring that language to government and try to make government more efficient. So I ran for office and started Doging my county long before Doge was even a word or a verb. Or an
It's a verb now, right?
Right. Yeah. So I was Doging before Doge was even an acronym, before it was a verb. And when I came into office, I won the primary election in early 2018. And then I was married that fall. And it was trending like I was going to win this election in November. So I came into the office to get my marriage license. And the employees in the office did not realize that I was going to be their future boss. I knew I was going to be their future boss. So I was like a secret shopper. I was coming in as a secret shopper. And my now husband, soon to be husband at the time, he was working at Fidelity Investments at the time. And she had to take a day off work before our wedding so that we could go down and get our obligatory permissions from the government so that an ecclesiastical figure could marry us, which did not make any sense to me. But here we are, the day before our wedding. He's off work. We had to go down to a government building between 8:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. to go get this marriage certificate. And they handed us a clipboard with a shoestring with a pen attached to the clipboard of the shoestring. And we filled out, sat down and hand wrote these applications. And then we handed the application to a very nice, well-meaning lady who then sat there, and we sat there and watched her retype everything we had put on a piece of paper into the computer. And multiple times she would grab the clipboard and say, "What letter is that? Or what does this say?" And then she would type it in. And it was just incredibly inefficient. And then on the back end, after the marriage ceremony had taken place, we were married on a Friday night. We had our reception on a Saturday. We get on an airplane, head to go get on a cruise for our honeymoon. My cousin, who was visiting from Canada for the wedding, took the filled out, signed marriage license and shows up at the office Monday morning so that she can turn it in so that the marriage can be registered and be official. And she shows up at the office at 4:28. Big sign on the door says we closed at 4:30. All she has to do is just hand them a piece of paper. The door is locked. So she knocks on the door and she can hear someone on the other side say, "It's okay, just don't answer it. They'll go away. These are my future employees."
Wow.
Right. So when I came into office, one of the very first things I did is say, this process is broken. It is antiquated. It has not changed in literally 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, people have gone to some sort of a magistrate or government office and written on paper, either with a quill or a pen, so that they can get a marriage license to have somebody perform their marriage. And I knew that that process needed to be. So as we went through and wanted to make this completely paperless, we knew how to do that front end. But when it came to issuing the marriage certificate, how do you issue electronic marriage certificate? It was just a PDF. We were actually generating PDFs, printing them, and putting like a seal as if it was like, 1473. We're putting a seal on them and then handing them to people, and this is their marriage certificate. And I said, how can we do this electronically? And then blockchain was the answer that I came to. Knowing enough about blockchain and recognizing this, you can create a hash and put it in a blockchain and have that be immutable. This is a way that we can ensure that this electronic document is unaltered. So we started doing that in the fall of 2019. At the same time, one of my other duties was I was over elections. And as we had to rebuild our election system from the ground up because it was so antiquated here in our county. And as we started looking at overseas and military members, my chief deputy at the time was a former Marine. And as we started discussing our own experiences voting in the 2008 election year, which is a fairly pivotal year, if you remember, that was the year that Barack Obama was on the ballot and won. In that fairly pivotal year, I was living in Canada as a field service engineer for Caterpillar, and he was serving our country in Fallujah, Iraq as a Marine. in a combat zone. And that year, I received my absentee ballot for the primary election, but Josh didn't receive his in Fallujah. So I voted in the primary that year, but I never received my ballot in the general. And Josh didn't receive his in the primary, but he did receive his for the general. So we had two people in the exact same year, one of them in Canada just across the border, and one of them is literally fighting for freedom. And both of us in one of those two elections was disenfranchised and didn't have the ability to vote. So we said, okay, well, how can we find a solution for this? And what we discovered was the most viable solution that included identity verification, electronic delivery of ballot, and ensured that a ballot was returned that was completely auditable and transparent and immutable, was utilizing blockchain technology. So we deployed it that year so that we could test that heading into the presidential year of 2020.
Wow, that's a great story.
That is a great story. And I tell you, before we get into where you are now and the conversations we've had, can we go to Paul? Because Paul's got a great story too. And I think it gives the audience an understanding of these are two people that have been in the business of solving problems and how they came to blockchain. Because I think there's a lot that is learned in the process. You know, there's the old saying that if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. In this case, that's not the case. There were some nails that needed to be hammered, and you guys eventually came to blockchain as a solution. Paul, can you share your story of how you came to blockchain?
Sure. So I was working in this marriage license office in Utah County. So my career, I actually started life, I was an engineer too. I studied aeronautics and astronautics. And originally I was a manufacturing engineer building engines for Ford, but transitioned early on in my career to banking operations. And at the time, with the advent of technology, they were looking for people with like production experience to manage their operational processes. And so I got involved with the international institutional businesses, global custody, securities lending, prime brokerage, and supporting trading desks. So have worked with the industry's infrastructure around the world. You know, I've lived and worked, I'm originally from the UK, but lived here in the States. I've lived in Singapore and Australia. I've covered Latin America and Asia and the markets. So understand how complicated and disparate the operational infrastructure is. And just by chance, when I was working on a strategy and innovation for simplifying some transactions inside one of the bigger global banks, someone came along and said, there's this thing called a blockchain. And I was like, okay, what is this thing? What is this technology? And by chance, I happened to join the boutique consultancy and they asked me to look into it. And what I saw was this potential of peer-to-peer B2B settlement in hours, if not minutes, a consistent ledger. But I also saw some of the limitations which really didn't meet the requirements of the financial services in terms of scale, capacity, accounting functionality. And that led to the design of Tapestry X. And I've had a great team of supporters from our board, as well as a CEO who comes from a similar part of the industry to me, and another colleague who's come from operational experience and consulting. So we've built out Tapestry X, but because we've made it available to do any type of transaction with any asset and securities business, it also lends itself to other use cases such as supply chain or documentation and records management. But it's been a great journey and trying to keep up with all the technological advances. Although we're not necessarily in the crypto DeFi space, you know, we have to keep charge of all that stuff. And the interesting part, and you know, my introduction to government was through listening to Gerard, you know, talk about how slow governments are to take on new technology and how notoriously difficult they are to deal with. And I thought, if I can help with that process, as well as possibly getting a good client as well, then I'm all in.
Good luck.
I got a million questions, but Kevin, do you have any questions you want to ask him? Because I'm just going to pepper them with questions. They're not going to know what hit them.
No. But I mean, both the stories are really fascinating. But the thing about government, I mean, with the recent news, and your head, Amelia, must be spinning with the rapidity of how things have changed from, oh, I hate crypto to, oh, I love crypto so fast. And going from marriage licenses on blockchain to now, you are actually looking at implementing budgets on blockchain for the federal government. And with, you know, Doge looking at doing that for the entire treasury of the United States. So why is putting a budget on blockchain so important for the government?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note how to tell our stories where we had actual problems that we're looking for solutions. One of the problems that the blockchain industry has had in the past is that, particularly during the previous boom, people wanted to blockchain for the sake of blockchain, right? And I've always been a huge advocate of saying, don't use blockchain just for the sake of blockchain. Use blockchain when it's the viable solution, right? I think it's important to recognize that blockchain is a solution for voting and for marriage licenses for the same features that make it perfect for a budget. And that is immutability and transparency. Those are the key features of blockchain technology. It is immutable, so you know it has not been altered or changed, and it brings a level of transparency. And those two things fit so well in government, but particularly in budget. In the budget space, one of the reasons I'm looking at this is of my portfolio departments, I have the health department. So I sit on the board of health. I'm the supervisor for the director of the board of health for my county. And this is in my portfolio. One of the issues that we have right now is that for the last several years, our health department has been running a deficit in its budget. We have one of the fastest growing populations in my county right now. Last year, my county equated 43% of the state's growth. 43% of the entire state of Utah's growth happened right in my county. And so when you're growing at such a rapid rate, the services that citizens need oftentimes outpace the budgets that you have to provide those services. And this is what's happening in the health department. So as I'm going through and trying to balance this budget before our fund balance runs out, and we have to do mass layoffs and cut major services, I'm trying to analyze the budget. And I'm trying to come in and say, okay, we have 23 different programs in the health department. I want each program, I want to know how much of your budget is federal grants, how many of that are state grants, how many of that are private grants, how much of it is fee-based, fee for service, and how much of it is coming from the tax base, from the general fund. And you'd think these would be easy questions, but they're not. So the way that government budgets often work is you've got revenue sources, and those revenues all go into one fund, like your bank account. Those revenues all go into one bank account. But then on the back end, we get bills and we pay those bills. But we don't always have a direct tie between the money in and the money out. And so as I'm trying to determine which program, it does me no good to cut a program that has a federal or a state grant that funds the whole thing. I have to determine which programs are the ones that are pulling money out of our tax base. And then I need to go to my citizens and I need to say, which of these do you value? Which of these do you value enough for me to raise taxes to pay for it? Or do you want me to cut? But I can't even get to that point until I can trace the flow of money. And this is where blockchain comes in. As we're getting federal grants and state grants, I want to be able to put those in a blockchain. And then as the money is going out, I want to be able to show so that I can trace that money in, money out path, which ironically is a lot harder than you'd think.
Yeah. So it's really about the color of money, so to speak. You have to match your colors that come in to the payments that go out.
Correct.
So this is really fascinating. So Paul, there's really a need here in tracking the budget, but blockchain is a new technology that many people aren't aware of or really know how it works. And there must be a lot of technical and process requirements to make something like, as complex as tracking the budget of a government happen. Can you give us some insight into that?
Sure. There's a lot of different requirements there. One of the key things about blockchains, and I'll add to what Amelia said, is that you're having a shared ledger where everyone has a copy of the same ledger and they trust their copy to validate transactions that are processed with them. That's actually indirectly what you're doing is actually having a synchronized data set between multiple parties. And it's also consistent in its format. So, again, I'm sure Amelia would agree with you. If everything's in the same format, in the same consistent process, then it's a lot easier to handle. It's a lot easier to interrogate. And so that's one of the, you could argue for a central ledger, but the problem is you've got these multiple places, as Amelia said, you've got multiple tax types, multiple revenue sources, and then you've got hundreds of ways to spend that money. and they could all be positioned. But that suits itself to a network, and that's what a distributed ledger can do. So that consistency, you really want the solution to be configurable as well, so easy to adapt, because I'm sure, as Amelia was saying, you're going to change taxes, you're going to change expenditures, so you need to be able to track different things and evolve with yourself. The key word you said, and I think Amelia said, was tracking. You're actually going to be saying, what do I expect to happen and what has actually happened? And in accounting terms, you've got receivables for tax revenues and you've got payables for appropriations. So if you can record those and then track your progress against them, as the transfers come in, you can draw down your obligations. Therefore, you've got a means to tracking it. And that's really a key thing. It ultimately is a financial ledger, so it should have accounting. Other things, obviously, it needs to be transparent, and you could have a public node with aggregate data. So you reveal as much data as the public's entitled to. You don't necessarily have to put everything there, but whatever's required. But it has to be secure, because you don't want it to be attacked and you don't want it to be done. Another concern I was thinking was that it should be modular, because again, you may want to, if we're talking about, we're talking about a county government, within a state government or a federal government, there could be multiple areas. So you may want to have networks of networks. And can the solution be implemented in a transitional state rather than a big bang? Because obviously that will make it easier. I'm just thinking, the other thing as well is you're talking about tracking money. So you're bringing money into a sort of tokenized environment, moving it around, but ultimately it's got to go back to the legacy rails for paying employees or paying vendors. So that interoperability with legacy infrastructure is key. And ultimately, if it's not your primary ledger, it ultimately has to feed some form of general ledger to be the proper financial audited reports that are produced at the end. So I think that sort of covers quite a few points there. But really, you've got to look at this as, very simply, the distributed way means it can be managed and utilized across a very complicated organization. But if you get it into the same format, and it's basically a financial ledger, so you can record your transactions and read your data, then you've got a solution that's going to be consistent and much more efficient, and obviously transparent is the key word across the across the government.
Yeah, Kevin, if I could throw a question in here.
Yeah, sure.
So it's really a two-part question. The first part is, and I want to throw this to you first, Amelia. When you decided to bring blockchain into these new spaces, I imagined that the people you worked with, a lot of the folks in your environment, just opened up their arms and welcomed it with hugs and kisses, right? And so my question is, and we're going to come back around a little bit more to, the project that you're engaged with and how people can get involved and find more about it. But before we get there, I'd like to hear from your perspective, what are some of the things that we will have to overcome? Saying we're going to put budget tracking on a blockchain sounds great as a campaign slogan, right? As we know, RFK basically made that as a campaign promise when he was running for president as an independent. Really, really wonderful thing to say, a little harder to do, right? So from your experience in terms of just bringing a blockchain into either of those two use cases, what have you learned, and how can those lessons learned be applied to moving forward with our project on putting budget tracking on the blockchain?
Yeah. So, to go back to your original question there, did people embrace this with open arms? It was change, and it was technology, and I'm in government, so no. They don't tend to like change. They don't tend to like technology. So it was very difficult, but helping people see the vision and helping them see the end, and not actually spending any time explaining the technology. The least amount of time that you spend explaining the technology, the better off you're going to be. You need to talk about the features and the benefits, right? This comes back to sales. We used to find this at Caterpillar where we're selling machinery. The engineers wanted to come in and talk about a planetary gear set. No one buying a bulldozer cares that you use a planetary gear set on a raised sprocket. What they care about is that you have a higher torque load, which means you can push more dirt. And they care about the raised sprocket because it means that you have less wear and tear because it's up out of the elements. So you talk about the features and the benefits of the technology rather than the technology itself. Part of the problem is this is such a new and emerging technology that the only people that play in this space are nerds like us who love the technology. And so we want to explain the technology, and that doesn't actually help our case. I never went around to people and said, did you know that you have a blockchain marriage certificate? What I said was, you have a digital certificate that you can keep on your phone. And when you need it, you can access it without having to remember where you put it. Right. And so you have to look at that. The other thing that's key in order to get buy-in. So as a commissioner, I don't actually do the work of the county. I set a vision, I place votes, I attend a lot of meetings, but the way that I get things accomplished is helping employees see the vision. I have 1,500 people that work for me, and they're the ones that do the hard work. They are the public servants, but they need to see my vision. They need to see why it matters and how it makes a difference, and then they implement it. But one of the ways we do that is that we make it easy for them to implement, which means we need to find ways. If we have what we consider to be a superior technology, but that technology does not work with the processes that exist today, that technology will not get adopted. We need to be willing to take a superior technology and break it down into sometimes what's inferior, but better than what we currently have, and see if we can make them work together. So finding ways to implement that technology into the existing systems and the existing processes and help the employees see how it makes their job better, faster, cheaper, and better serves our citizens is how you do that. And it's not easy and it's not fast.
Let me give the audience a little bit of background in terms of sort of what led up to this webinar and kind of where we're going. And then, Paul, I want to ask you some questions in terms of more of the technical stuff. But the reason why we came together is, like I said, in 2018, we started thinking about this, but nobody wanted to talk to us. When RFK ran for president as an independent, he identified that he wanted to put the whole government budget on a blockchain. He didn't win the White House, but he did get HHS. So we thought, let's go to HHS and see if we can, help him fulfill his promise. HHS was smaller than the whole federal government, but it was still a pretty big animal. And then we thought, it might be a good idea to pilot this. And this is where we talked to Amelia, and she shared with us the challenges she was having, basically connecting income to outcome. So the project that we're working on, it's part of the Government Blockchain Association's Budget Accountability and Transparency Working Group, is to essentially help Amelia do that, right? She has oversight over the county health department, the IT department, and the audit department, right? She needs to solve this problem. So we've brought the vast wealth of the GBA knowledge together in sort of support of that. Our plan is to take the output from that pilot, that's lessons learned, take it to states, right? Do it at a bigger level, maybe do it across the county, right? But sort of to grow it from there, maybe also do it in other counties, in other states, and then eventually bring it to the federal government, because you can't basically take a kindergartner and expect them to pass, high school or college exams. There's a process of maturing that has to happen. So I'm going to come back to you in a second to kind of walk us through your vision for how that happens, right? But before I do, Paul, you face a lot of similarities in terms of trying to implement things in a technical environment in bank and financial services. What are the challenges that you have seen or faced there in terms of, banks have very huge infrastructures, lots of transactions, a lot of risk, right? And so when Amelia is going down this pathway, they're going to face the same things, especially when we go to state and federal levels. What are some of the things that you've learned in terms of overcoming those barriers that potentially Amelia, you can see Amelia facing as well? So Paul, overcoming the barriers like Amelia talked about, and then Amelia, what's your view, your plan, your passion for how we roll this project forward? So Paul, and then Amelia.
Sure. I think, the advantage of Amelia is that she's embracing the new technology. People are wary, as she said, of new technology. Through the GBA, I met Scott Stornetta, who's the guy that recorded the first public blockchain in 1991, and his articles are cited in the Bitcoin white paper with Stuart Haber. And when we were talking to him, he didn't give us any advice on the technology. He gave us the book called Crossing the Chasm, because you've got the early majority, the early majority is easy, they take it, but there's this gap. Sorry, the early adopters are easy, but the early majority, no one wants to be first. So you've got this sort of chicken and egg situation. So part of the challenge is convincing them that it's going to be used. The second challenge is once they've got to the point of saying, let's try this out, they don't really think of the holistic requirements. And I went through a bunch of challenges earlier in this discussion. You really have to think of everything, not because you have to necessarily address all those issues, but you have to know how you're going to address it. So a lot of these companies in the banking and finance jumped into a solution and then found it couldn't scale. Whereas the white paper actually said, by the way, we can't scale. We can't handle that capacity, or we don't have the functionality to do proper loans and accounting. And so they've gone through this sort of incremental approach. You can have an incremental step as long as you know where your end game is and you're going to cover the bases. If you're trying to just try as you go, you're going to trip and fall or find out that the solution doesn't meet all your requirements. And I've been involved with the blockchain maturity model with the GBA, and that's a great way to have your actual solution assessed. So that's one of the things that you may want to consider. I think, again, coming back to some of the points, how easy is this technology to be adopted? And I don't want to throw away my pricing negotiation, but it should be cheap to run and maintain. And as Amelia said, it really does need to complement the current technology. It's not taking over everything. It's becoming the ledger for what are current applications. So how simple as it is to integrate with those. And again, I'll just reiterate, the key thing is write down the requirements. Amelia talked about what's the end result, like, oh, I've got a digital license on my phone. Okay. What are the requirements to do that? Don't try and make the force fit the technology. Write out your requirements. And again, in certain cases, you may be better off with a centralized database. You don't need a blockchain. So that's the kind of thing where we want, you really want to think it through.
So Amelia, given the experiences you've had in the past and some of the things that Paul said, walk us through your vision or what your plan is going forward on how do we, at least with the Utah County Health Department, how do we get budget tracking on a blockchain? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So, one of the folks leave a comment that, isn't blockchain slow and expensive? Well, those are relative terms. In government, as we're tracking budget and spending, we don't need 100 transactions a minute. We don't need 1,000 transactions a second. It's not like this is Visa, and we don't actually have to track every single transaction. We just need to track the budget line items. So we need to track every budget line item and see where its revenue sources came from. So this could be done at the very, very most, maybe once a week. We would need to track that. But in reality, we could do it when we reconcile accounts and when we reconcile lines. So it could be done quarterly, right? So if you're looking at that, and then if you look at putting on a blockchain, even if that costs $20 and you were doing it quarterly or weekly, the overall cost to be able to track a $40 million budget is very low. So this goes back to what Paul was saying. Sometimes blockchain might not be your best solution. If you're looking at doing hundreds of transactions a minute and they're small dollar amount transactions, then yeah, it might be too slow and it might be too expensive. But as you're looking at a large budget and tracking that system, this is very attainable. So things just happen to be aligning. We went through an RFP recently to put in a new enterprise system. And the enterprise system that we selected was Oracle. And it was after we picked Oracle that I learned that Oracle had done some of the early work on putting budgeting on blockchain. If we had picked a solution that didn't integrate with blockchain, then we would have to create a parallel system. That would be more work and it would be more money, in which case we would have to evaluate, is blockchain going to be the best solution for us? But because last year, our RFP team, we had a team of 12 employees, everyone from the sheriff's department to HR to the auditor's office, got together and picked Oracle as the solution. There happens to be a blockchain integration in Oracle that will work for us, making the system fairly easy. So my goal is, this new system actually isn't in place yet. We're in the process of implementing that system. As we implement that system, we'll be working with folks to see how can we trace this money coming in and going out. With that said, as we're tracing it going out, we won't trace it to the individual because we want to make sure that we're not tracking people's personally identifiable information. We'll trace it down to the program level. And each program serves hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of individuals. And so we won't trace it to the individual level until we're sure that we have the ability to ensure those people's privacy.
I hear some great value to the government by leveraging blockchain, but how does it bring value to your constituents, to the people, as you're doing this?
Yeah, I think it's very valuable for the constituents and the individuals to have that transparency in their government. You'd be shocked at the number of crazy things that I learn on the internet about what we do here at the county that I'm like, really? Then what did I do? During COVID, for example, there was a surge in employees. We had to hire a bunch of employees to help deal with COVID parameters. And in the ramp down after COVID, we laid off over 100 employees because these are employees that have been hired for temporary things, as we no longer need to have the number of people in epidemiology that are tracking contact tracing, and we don't have these big vaccine clinics as we laid those people off. But you've got people in the public. In fact, we had candidates running for office saying things like they hired 120 people and they haven't laid a single person off. But being able to have some of these records to show people, yeah, you can actually see, yes, payroll did go up, but it also went back down. And you could show them these transparencies to show that. The other aspect of that, it's ensuring that their tax dollars are being spent on the things that we tell them they're being spent on. So a lot of it is transparency and accountability.
If I could ask Paul to comment on something that Amelia said. So the question of the comment was, aren't blockchains slow and such inefficient, right? When Amelia answered, she said, you know what? We don't need things to be that fast because the process is slow, right? But there's entirely new paradigms on how to work with blockchain that can eventually lead to real-time settlement. And one of the problems we have now in government tracking is it's always kind of rearview mirror. So Paul, I know you've done a lot of research in this space. What can be done to essentially get closer to real-time settlement, right? So in government, because especially when we scale up to state and national level, there's a lot more transactions. But from a technical perspective, if somebody wants to be able to scale up, what are some things that can be done? Maybe some of the things that you learned in your research and in your work.
Sure. And I would say, I'd agree with Amelia in a lot of these use cases, particularly in government. Again, looking at the requirements, if you do have a high latency, low volume use case, then your solution may not need to have the performance that's required. But the key thing, and this is one of the, is particularly in finance where we found the limits in blockchains. And I joke, blockchain is the technology of the future that forgot the future, because it can tell you what happens today and it can give you the immutable history, but it can't tell you anything about tomorrow or the future. And most people rely on their smart contract algorithms to wake up and do something in the future, but you can't accrue, you can't reconcile to that. So you've got to have the ability. What you do want to record is what often when you're dealing with any type of transaction, you're invoicing someone, which is a payable to somebody and a receivable to the other party. So you need to be able to record those obligations and date them to the future when they're due. So that idea of having a financial ledger with proper accounting and payable receivables is a key thing. We found a way, we saw one of the other challenges in the financial services is that if you're using consensus or if you're using independent validators, there's a cost, a risk, and a liability to that. And it's also a part where collusion can happen, although it's relatively hard to do with Byzantine fault tolerance or even potentially punishment through staking. We actually found a way through a method that's called conflict-free replicated data types that the nodes can actually synchronize on the transaction data alone. So we've obviated that need for validation. And that gives us the real-time processing, because in most blockchains, the transactions are proposed and then they're validated and then they're shared back. Well, there's latency, there's capacity constraints, and there's risk and liability. So we wanted to get rid of that. The other thing that people forget is the classic problem that Bitcoin sort of solved was the double spend. But Bitcoin allows a double spend to occur. It just doesn't allow it to get into the final record. But there's a period in time where the double spend exists. We wanted to stop the double spend from ever even having a chance of getting in the front door. So that's one of the things where you've got to, look at controls and requirements. But I think that those are sort of examples, I think, what you were talking to, Gerard, in terms of, where looking after people's money and looking after people's securities is a sort of very, you can't do that lightly. Outside of the regulatory requirements, you just can't say, oops, it's all missing. As we found out with FTX running a single entry spreadsheet, that funny enough, they lost track of everything. Well, who's surprised at that? So this is where, the control and processing of transactions on a ledger is a serious business. And, that's what we've addressed.
Wow. So we're coming to the top of the hour. So I want to first go to Paul and then go to Amelia, where NFT Eve blockchain says, I want to know how voter ID can be both private and public. And I could probably add the blockchain also. What's the latest masking tech to make this actually happen there, Paul?
I think I'll defer to Amelia on this one because I know she's actually implemented a voting system.
If each voter ID was given a cryptographic hash, then you could track any changes that happened on your voter registration. This is something that I was talking to folks about in 2019. I felt that this is probably one of the best uses of blockchain technology in elections. I think regardless of the method of voting, whether you're voting online, in person with paper, in person electronically, or vote by mail, the biggest weakness in our election system is the voter rolls. When you look at the voter registration for any particular state, you've got their voter IDs and then you've got all their information. And as people look at that, they'll hide that private information, but they'll keep that voter ID public. You could still keep the voter ID public, but then hash the personal data, put it on a blockchain, and then any changes to that database or to that voter registration list would be trackable and traceable.
I mean, there's technology known as zero knowledge proofs where you can prove something without revealing it. But I think the key point you're saying, Amelia, is that while today you can have a vote associated with a voter, but it's very hard to confirm, if it was corrupted in any way, that person's vote is exactly as they intended. Whereas the blockchain allows you to do that without revealing the identity of the voter. So imagine you could check your vote without having your name associated with it on a public record.
Right.
Okay, that sounds great. So one other thing I want to sort of get both of your ideas on is a question that came up last week when Elon Musk was on that podcast. If the government is going to go this way with blockchain, should they use existing public blockchains that have been proven and have sort of proven themselves in the marketplace as scalable and viable? Or should the government go on and build its own blockchain that's a proprietary or permissioned ledger? What are your thoughts on that question?
I think it depends what problem they're trying to solve. It depends on the solution, right? In certain cases, having an internal blockchain or distributed ledger, if you will, is going to be a better process. There are ways that it can create significant efficiency. I mean, is it expensive? Yes. But let me tell you how car titles work. So right now, over 80% of the cars on the roads are financed. So there's some sort of a loan on those cars. And what happens is you go to buy the car, let's say you buy it from a dealership, and that dealership, they get the title, and they send the title to the lien holder, to your bank. And that lien holder then registers the title with the state, and the state issues them a new title in their name instead of the dealership's name. And then they send it back to that bank, and that bank promptly shreds the title because they don't want to have to store it in a warehouse full of filing cabinets. And then when you sell that vehicle, they go back to the DMV, they request a new title, and then the government prints that title and sends it to them, and then they send it to you, and then it goes to the new owner of the car. And the new owner of the car, it goes to their banking institution, who then sends it to the DMV, prints a new title in their name, sends it back, and then they shred it. This is not efficient. We could do this whole thing in a private permissioned blockchain. And we could just transfer the title back and forth. And then if you actually pay off your car and you need that title, then the DMV could print you that title and send it to you if you want it. But if you have a wallet, there's no reason they couldn't just send it to your wallet.
One of the features of Tapestry X is we have an auto shredder. It's an optional action. No.
But there's times that it would make sense to do this on a blockchain, right? We don't need a public blockchain for a lot of these things.
No, I think it comes down to you've got to look at the requirements of the use case and then assess your solution. And again, similar to our story, obviously, diplomatically, I'd say that's what you're going to do. Biasedly, I'd say, well, why don't you try Tapestry X? I mean, we found the blockchains couldn't meet the requirements in the financial services, and that's why a lot of these blockchains, enterprise blockchains, have struggled with the larger scale, more complicated use cases. So I'd look at your requirements and say, does the solution meet your requirements? And then if there's none out there, then that would be the justification for the government to build its technology. But on my experience, or government-built technology is not usually, it's a design by committee and not necessarily the optimal way. I do believe there's really good solutions out there. And we're in the GBA for multiple use cases with the BMM assessment, we've seen that.
We're at the top of the hour, but Gerard, I tell you, this has been amazing, this conversation. What do you pull from it so far?
Well, I'll tell you the thing that I pulled from it so far is that we're going to need smart people on both the technology side and also the government operations side to pull this off, right? Because there are a lot of pitfalls, there's a lot of landmines, and I'm just grateful that we have Paul and Amelia working on this. If you're interested in participating in the working group, please go to gvaglobal.org. Consider joining. We'd be happy to have you work with us. Also, check out the blockchain maturity model. So underneath resources, you'll see a link to the BMM. We built standards for identity. So I think it was NFT Eve talked about that. AI, supply chain, all of that. And Amelia, in fact, the Oracle blockchain cloud infrastructure just passed the BMM rating, right? How important is it to you as a government official that when you're acquiring solutions that they can meet some type of third-party certifications?
Especially with an emerging technology, it's critical. Oftentimes in government procurement, we ask for things like 5 previous government contracts, or we're looking at 10 years of service. And when it comes to an emerging technology, those things are just simply not possible. And so having a third-party verifier is critical so that we know that this is a technology that has been evaluated. It's really the peer-reviewed study of science, right? In science, you have a peer-reviewed study. In technology, having something like a third-party verification, like the VMM, is critical for us to know that we are utilizing the taxpayer dollars wisely.
Absolutely.
Excellent. I'd like to also invite everyone to learn more about the National DigiFoundry, where Oracle is now one of the technologies that you can leverage to build and test your blockchain-based or digital asset-based solution. And as you all know, this show is produced by Digital Transformers. So enjoy and find Digital Transformers where you see your podcast. Thank you very much for joining us for GovTech Live.
Thank you for supporting Digital Transformers and for being a part of our global Supply Chain Now community. Please check out all of our programming at supplychainnow.com. Make sure you subscribe to Digital Transformers anywhere you listen to or view the show, and follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. See you next time on Digital Transformers.